Before I get started, I just want to give you a little disclaimer. Today I'm going to be talking about some disturbing things, some evil things. I don't want anyone to lose sight of the fact that Jesus is Lord over all, and everything falls under His authority. No matter how powerful evil is, evil is much stronger than we can deal with on our own, in our own strength. But it is nothing compared to the power of God.
Amen.
I don't want you to lose sight of that, lose track of that while I'm talking about some of the things that happen and are coming on the earth. So please keep that in mind, and I'll try to remind you again when I'm done. So we've been talking about deception, and this is week 3, or this is part 3, I guess I should say. Part 3 of deception. Why am I dwelling on this so much? Because we live in an age of deception, folks. Deception is all around us, and it's so powerful and so widespread. There's probably no one here within the sound of my voice, including myself, that understands how deeply it actually goes. The devil's very crafty, and he can get used to that. The devil's very crafty, and he can concoct some very complex, confusing schemes to lead us into deception, or to lead us away from the truth, I should say. All right, so last week we went back to the very first lie, or the very first instance of deception that happened in the garden. And we looked at the elements of that first deception and how those same elements have been used to deceive people ever since. And just a quick rehash. When you look at the things that the serpent spoke to Eve, these were some of the elements. There won't be any consequences if you do this sin, if you commit this sin. Or the consequences won't be significant. They won't be that big. You won't surely die, Eve. Implying what? That God's a liar. That God either didn't mean it, or that he was lying when he told Adam that he would die. What's another one? Maybe God didn't forbid it anyway.
Or he doesn't mean what he said.
Exactly. Questioning the word, questioning God's word. That's not really what it means. Or he didn't mean that. That's not what he said. Another one is, the pleasure you get from the sin makes it worthwhile, makes it worth doing. What you get from this fruit, Eve, is so good. It's so good. That stuff God said doesn't really matter. You can apply that to things nowadays, I'm sure. The buzz you're going to get off that alcohol is so good. You're going to feel so good this weekend. That's more important than what God told you. The high you're going to get off of that drug, that junk, that poison you're putting in your body, that's so good. It's just so good, it's going to make it all worthwhile. It's a lie, folks. It's one aspect of the deception. Another one, you just have to experience this pleasure. You just have to. God offers no alternative that's as good as this sin. God doesn't want you to eat this, Eve, because he knows that you'll get knowledge that way. He's not offering you knowledge. He's forbidding knowledge. Eat this and you'll get it. You'll get the thing that he doesn't want you to have. And then you know better what's good for you. You got a brain, you can think for yourself, you can handle your own business, you don't need God telling you what to do. Which in other words means you can be your own God, right? You can create your own reality, your own morality. You can decide for yourself what's right and wrong, and what's good and evil, what's beneficial and detrimental. What it comes down to, those are the aspects that I pointed out. What it comes down to, in a nutshell, we can sum up last week this way: God's people love the truth. God's people love the truth. And the truth can set you free. Set you free from what? It can set you free from sin. And who's the one that uses sin? Thank you. Satan's called what? The father of lies. Right? Ties right back into that deception thing. It can save you from sin. It can rescue you from sin, from the consequences of sin, and from the father of lies. If you love the truth. If you seek the truth. Conversely, those who do not love the truth, and that's most of the world population, folks, they're setting themselves up to be enslaved by sin, deception, the father of lies. Which takes me back to 2 Thessalonians 2, for those who have a Bible. I've read this one before. I'm going to read a few more verses with it this time. Second Thessalonians 2, starting at verse 7. For those who don't know, Paul was writing this letter to the church at Thessalonica. And by the way, when you hear me or other people talk about the church at Corinth, the church at Thessalonica, the church at Rome, or whatever it is, churches were a lot different back then. And what we think of church was a lot different back then. I should say the church has always been the same. The church is people. The church is believers. You and I, if you are a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ, we are the church.
Amen.
We tend to think of the church as a building. That's wrong, wrong, wrong.
Yes, sir.
They didn't have that understanding back then. They weren't confused like we are. So he was writing to the believers at Thessalonica. And he was talking about they kind of got disturbed and confused about the end times, because that's one of the first lessons he taught them. And he's responding. He wrote 2 letters to them. This is the second one that we know of. And he's responding to their confusion, trying to make it a little more clear to them what he was trying to say the first time. So starting in verse 7, he says, "For the secret power of lawlessness is already at work. But the one who now holds it back will continue to do so until he is taken out of the way. And then the lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord Jesus will overthrow with the breath of his mouth and destroy by the splendor of his coming." Keep that in mind. I tried to warn y'all that despite everything I'm talking about, God is still more powerful. He is still superior to it.
Amen.
That's what Paul is doing here in this verse.
Amen.
He's introducing this guy, the man of lawlessness, who says, but don't worry, God is going to deal with him. That's why I said the Lord Jesus will overthrow him with the breath of his mouth and destroy him by the splendor of his coming. Verse 9, "The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth,
Amen.
and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie,
Amen.
and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth but have delighted in wickedness." I'm going to break this down for you. If you would, baby, let me know if I'm going too long, because I can always cut this in half. I do have quite a few pages here.
Don't move the word, my son.
Right, I've said this before, but I don't think I can stress it enough. That if you reject the truth, if you continue rejecting the truth, there comes a point when you run out of second chances. When God says, that's it, I've given you enough chances, you're done. And then God himself hands you over to your delusion, to your hatred of the truth, you could call it, to your love of lies. He hands you over to that. And once he hands you over to that, folks, there's nothing and nobody that can save you from it. He is full of grace and he is full of mercy, full of compassion, and he gives us untold numbers of chances, but there comes a limit to that. And that's something we don't want to reach ever. All right, the first thing I want to point out in the passage I read you was that phrase he used, that term he used called the lawless one. Is anyone confused about who he's speaking of? I told you he was talking about the end times. He's not actually speaking about Satan. This guy's very like Satan. In fact, you could call him the son of Satan. The term that we use for him most popularly is the Antichrist. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to try to call him the beast when I refer to him, or one of his other names. Because there's many, there's a whole lot of different names that this guy is given in the Bible. A whole lot of different titles of this coming world dictator is what he is, really. And the most popular that we use most of the time is the Antichrist. Right? But I'm going to try to show you that that's not a good name to call him. All right? In fact, that's not one of the names given him in the Bible. That term appears 4 times in Scripture, all in 1st or 2nd John. Those are John's letters. The Apostle John is the one who wrote those, obviously. Don't get them confused with John the Baptist. Some people do that. If you remember the Apostle John, when he wrote about himself, what did he call himself? He said, the disciple who Jesus loved. He wanted to brag. He really wanted to brag, but that's the only thing he could brag about and still be humble. So that's what we're dealing with. So when you read the relevant verses in context, and I wrote them down here, they're in 1 John 2:18, 1 John 2:22, 1 John 4:3, and 2 John 1:7. Those are the places that you see the term the Antichrist used. It's the only place in the Bible that I found, in my Bible. When you see him use those terms, he's referring either to a spirit of Antichrist, or he's referring to people inspired by that spirit. People, plural, in general. So he's not referring to one specific individual that's going to pop up in future history. You can see how that would apply to just about anybody who is opposed or against the Lord. Because what does anti mean? Anti means against or opposed to. Right? So John, he defines the term Antichrist as anyone who denies that Jesus is the anointed one from God. I use that term anointed one. That's where we get the term Messiah, and in the Greek where we get the term Christ from. That's what those words mean. It means anointed one. Anointed one of God, I should specify. All right? So if the term means anyone who denies that Jesus is the anointed one, that applies to a whole lot of people, doesn't it? You can find them all over the internet, all over comment sections on blogs or in chat rooms and stuff. These people are everywhere. And according to John, they're all Antichrist, or they're led by the spirit of Antichrist. What did he say about it? I don't know if I put this in my notes, but I think I did, actually, so I'll hold off on saying that. So it applies to a whole bunch of people, not just right now, but all throughout history. Right? So John's letters, the Apostle John, his letters do not focus on end times prophecy. Certainly not to the degree the rest of the Bible does. Because it's all through the Bible, folks. As far back as Genesis, the very first book. And notice that his gospel does not include the Olivet Discourse. Does anyone not know, by show of hands, what the Olivet Discourse was? Okay. I'll take the who as a substitute for a raising of the hen.
What was that first word?
Olivet. It means, basically, it's a way of saying a private briefing he gave some of his disciples on the Mount of Olives. Olivet.
Oh, okay.
So the discourse, it's a, $15 word for a powwow they had up there.
Oh, okay.
All right, if you remember when they went to the temple and the disciples were saying, "Oh, look at this! Isn't this temple awesome? Look at it! It had been rebuilt since Solomon's day, but apparently it was still pretty impressive." And Jesus said, "You see all this stuff? He said, there's coming a day when not one stone is going to be left on another." And so when they got, there's a spider on my screen. Oh, I just smashed his guts all over the screen. I have to get some Windex. So when they got him in private, they said, "Lord, when is this stuff going to happen? And tell us about the end of the age. Tell us about that." So he said, so if you remember, I've read parts of this to you several times, but the very first thing he said is, take care that no one deceives you. That no one what? Deceives you. The very first thing he said. And then he started to tell them about it. And you guys have all heard bits and pieces of this. You heard about wars and rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines in various places. So that all comes from the Olivet Discourse. That's what that was. Okay. Now John,
Learn something new every day.
he doesn't cover that in the Gospel of John. And he doesn't really talk about it much in his letters. You know why? My position is that he didn't really need to, because he focused a whole book, an entire book on the Bible, on that subject. And the title of that book is?
Revelations.
There you go. Revelation singular. It's a revelation of Jesus Christ.
That's right.
And it's actually, like I said, the whole Bible talks about the end time prophecy. It mentions it here and there, and it's usually scattered. But in Revelation, you have it concentrated. The bulk of that book is all about the end times. What's going to happen, who the key players are, and what spiritual forces are at work. Things that are coming on the earth. Now, when he wrote that book, now remember, he's the one that coined the term Antichrist. What does he call that individual in the book of Revelation? He calls him the beast. So that's why I make that distinction. And you may think I'm splitting hairs or nitpicking. I think it's important. Why do I think it's important? Because when we use the term Antichrist, because we know what anti means, we use that term and we think of someone who's opposed to Christ or against Christ. We think of these atheists and stuff, right? Don't get me wrong, this coming world dictator is opposed to Christ. He is against Christ. But that's not how most of the world is going to think of him. That's not how the lost are going to think of him. They're not going to see him as against Christ. They're going to see him as Christ. He's a fraud. He's a counterfeit is a word I'm going to use a lot. Imposter, thank you. He's an imposter. So remember, the devil hasn't created anything. Everything he does is a counterfeit. And I could go on and on about that quite a while, but his seed, or his offspring, that God mentioned in Genesis 3, that is a counterfeit Messiah. The whole world, we're told the whole world is going to follow this guy. Everyone who's not written in the Lamb's Book of Life, they're going to follow this guy. Why? Because they're deceived into thinking that he's the real deal.
Yep.
He is the anointed one, they think. And he's going to go out of his way. He's going to make a really impressive case to deceive them into thinking that. In fact, when this guy's introduced in the book of Revelation, he's introduced as a knockoff of the real deal.
Oh, well. Knockout of the real deal.
A knockoff.
What do you mean?
A cheap imitation.
Oh, okay.
Why do I say that? Because when he's introduced, you guys have heard of the four horsemen of the apocalypse,
Oh,
right?
yes.
He's the first one.
Who?
He's riding what? A white horse. Okay? That's in, that's in Revelation 6, verse 2. But see, in Revelation 19, verse 11, Jesus the Lord comes down on a white horse.
Oh.
So a lot of people actually get that confused. They think that this first horseman is him. No, if you look closely, look at the kind of crowns he wears, look at what he's carrying. No, you see that, no. He's impersonating the real deal. He's not the real deal, Holyfield. Nobody knows who Evander Holyfield is. I'm so disappointed. Most people have heard about the mark of the beast.
Yeah.
Right? People who've never read the Bible at all, they've heard about that.
Oh, yeah.
Even that is a counterfeit. That's a counterfeit.
Wow.
You read about that in Revelation 13:16. I read that right? Yeah. Well, anyway. And then Revelation 7:3, you actually learn about the seal that God puts on his people. God puts a seal on the foreheads of his people to protect them. That's the real thing. That's the real seal. And when you read in Exodus, and I actually read this not too long ago, probably read over it 1,000 times and just noticed it recently. Exodus 13, verse 9 and verse 16. God commands his people, at that point it was Israel, he said, put a mark, or no, he said, put my law on between your eyes. You taking pictures of me? Between your eyes, some translations say on your forehead and on your hand. If you guys have ever seen, I guess it's the Orthodox Jews and the Hasidic and stuff, they put those little boxes on their foreheads. I can't remember what they're called, olfactory or something, I can't remember. But that's what they're doing. They're following this instruction in Exodus. But how about that, the forehead and the hand?
Yeah.
That's what the real God said to do. That's what the fake God was going to have people do. And it's a lot more than what I'm saying here. And I can't get into that. That's not the focus of what I'm talking about today. But that's one aspect of the mark of the beast. It's a cheap imitation of the real thing. In this case, a very expensive imitation of the real thing. So we know that when world history is about the climax, this international dictator will come on the scene first. And we know that because of what it said in the verse I read earlier. The man of lawlessness being revealed. The Bible warns us over and over and over again that he's going to be sold to the world as the Messiah by signs and lying wonders and powerful deception. It says over and over again that he has a proud mouth. He speaks proud words and speaks lies and deceives many. Stresses that over and over and over again. He's going to have the whole world hoodwinked, is what it's trying to tell us. And like nobody ever before has. You think Hitler had people fooled? Folks, he got elected with only 40% of the German people. Brought him into power. But you didn't know that, right?
No, yeah.
There were a lot of people in Germany who did not support him. This guy's going to make him look like the small potatoes he was. That's just one example. It's the most famous example. Everyone thinks of Hitler when you think about evil.
Yeah.
When you think about charismatic, deceptive dictators. That's why I talk about him so much. Because I think everybody knows who he was. All right, one of the verses I read you a minute ago from 2 Thessalonians says, and this is verse 9, the coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with how Satan works. He will use all sorts of displays of power through signs and wonders that serve the lie, and all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. It says it's going to be in accordance with how Satan works. How does Satan work? I went over that in detail last time. All this hype about this guy serves the lie. Not a lie, not lies plural. I always find it interesting that it says the lie. It's talking about a specific lie. Different scholars have debated and proposed their own theories for about what this specific lie is going to be. And I'm not going to argue about that. Because my mind could change. I've been proven wrong about things before. And the more I read the Word, the more I find things that I didn't see before. And I realize, you know what, that opinion I had 5 years ago, I don't think that's right anymore. So, none of us are infallible. But what I do believe at this point, what sounds better to me than any other theory I've heard, is that the lie is just what I've been saying to you, that this guy is the Messiah. That would definitely fit as a pretty significant lie.
More than a while.
So right now, but anyway, this specific lie is going to be a humdinger. Says he's going to come in accordance with all the ways that wickedness deceives those who are perishing. And does that not fit? Wickedness deceives those who are perishing. Those who are lost. The wickedness deceives. I like a phrase used, and I can't remember the verse off the top of my head. But when Jesus is talking about the seed, he's giving the parable of the sower. He's talking about how the fate of the different seeds that are spread by the sower. He uses the phrase, the deceitfulness of riches. Boy, that is true, isn't it?
Ooh, yes, right on.
The love of money can deceive you. You'll deceive yourself if you love money. See it happen all the time and every day.
Perfect habit.
What I just read kind of reminded me of that. That's how Satan works. Wickedness deceives those who are perishing. Verse 7 says, for the secret power of lawlessness is already at work. The secret power of lawlessness is already at work. First thing I want to point out is that this was written over 2,000 years ago. Over 2,000 years ago, the secret power of lawlessness was already at work. It's not a new thing, folks. All right, and the next thing I want to point out is that phrase, secret power of lawlessness, that's a very good definition of our word, occult.
Definitely.
Or occultic.
Definitely.
In fact, that's what occult means. It means secret. So what you could say it this way, for the occult is already worked. This reminds me, and this is not in the notes, I'm going off track again here. But I'll be reminded if I'm getting too long-winded, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't know how much you guys know about the story of the Exodus. All right? Moses brought down plagues on Egypt. Brought down 10 plagues that the Lord sent on Egypt to convince Pharaoh to let his people go. Now, some of those plagues, it said Pharaoh's magicians were able to do the same thing. How were they able to do the same thing? The way it puts it in the NIV, and I think the ESV, is that through their magic arts, which could be translated, I'm saying, through their occultic arts, through their occultic practices. You remember Moses had Aaron throw his staff down, and his staff became a snake. Pharaoh's magicians did the same thing, didn't they? Of course, Aaron's snake ate both of their snakes. It shows you who has the most juice. But still, to look at it, just to look at what they're capable of doing, if you don't put it to the test. If you don't test the spirits, they all look powerful, don't they? Well, they all are powerful compared to us. It wasn't until they put it to the test. All right, let's see what these magician snakes can do against Aaron's snake. Y'all get where I'm understand what I'm getting at there?
Oh, sure.
Okay, I mentioned the occult, or occultic basically means secret arts or secret sciences, right? And we know just from reading the Bible that these are real. A lot of preachers, a lot of people behind the pulpit will try to convince you that it's all fake, it's all demagoguery, like Madam Cleo or Mistress Cleo or whatever it is on those 1-900 commercials. I don't even know if they have those anymore. I haven't watched TV in a long time. You know, the palm readers and the...
No, they made her stop.
Did they? Okay.
Yeah, years ago.
Well, anyway, the fortune tellers and these psychics and stuff that can supposedly help you out. People behind the pulpit will say, you know, that's all phonies, and I think...
Well.
Okay, I guess you won't get it.
Oh.
They'll try telling you there's all a bunch of cheap carnival hucksters and so forth, and a lot of them aren't, frankly. A lot of it is just...
Hokum.
Yeah, hokum, good word. Actually, good word for it. That doesn't mean it's all hokum, though. There are... Witchcraft does exist, and speaking of witchcraft...
Oh, yeah.
Tangent on a tangent. You know what word is translated as, you know, basically what we call black magic or witchcraft? The word used in the Bible in the Greek? Pharmakia.
Oh.
Does that sound familiar?
Oh, yes.
It's where we get the word pharmacy from. Which is where you get what? Drugs.
Mm-hmm.
And don't think that pharmakia refers only to legal drugs. It does not. They had no DEA back in those days. That's a form of witchcraft, folks. If you're taking a drug to simulate something that God can give you,
Oh, yeah, like
if you're depending on that, and yeah. If you want peace in your life, but you don't want to depend on the Prince of Peace, you're going to use codeine or marijuana or nicotine. I'm going to get my peace from them. You're practicing witchcraft. That's what you're doing. And it's idolatry if you want to look at it that way too.
Oh, definitely.
You're trusting in this thing, this substance, instead of trusting in the one who can give you the real deal. Because you know what, when you depend, and the same thing for ecstasy, I'm not talking about the drug ecstasy, I'm not sure exactly what that does, but I'm sure it applies. Any of these drugs, the things is that you can get the real thing from the Lord, and people are trying to get it the cheap way, the artificial way, and it turns out not so cheap after all. Because first of all, the rush, the joy, the high, whatever it is temporary. It goes away and it's harder and harder to get the more you keep abusing your body. Putting that poison in there, that junk in there. Whereas you could get the real thing that's eternal. Okay, end of that lecture. What's the tangent that I got off on that tangent from? I was talking about the occult. Okay, we got a lot of ideas about that word occult. There's a lot of connotations in the word. we tend to think of occult as we hear that word and we think of devil worshippers, right? And it does include that. So don't get me wrong, it does include that. But it doesn't necessarily mean devil worship in a Hollywood sense. So that's what it ultimately is, what it ultimately leads to. What am I saying? Because of what I've taught here many times before. Jesus said, those who are not with me are against me. If you're not with Jesus, you're against him. Which means there's two camps that you go into. You're in the kingdom of God or the kingdom of this earth, the kingdom of this age, which is ruled by who? The devil, the father of lies. All right? So if you're serving someone else, so your magic arts, and I don't care whether you call it black magic or white magic, you think you're Casper the Friendly Ghost or Glinda the Good Witch or whatever it is, if you're not serving Jesus, so that narrows it down. You're serving the enemy. That's witchcraft. That's the occult. Hope I didn't confuse anybody on that. I didn't know. Might not have phrased that as eloquently as someone else could. So we know that the secret power of lawlessness has been around a long time, or the power of the occult has been around a long time, and I want to point you to Ezekiel chapter 8 for proof of this. It's something you find right in the Bible. What God showed the prophet in a vision was that the kingdom of Judah had become so corrupt that a conspiracy in the priesthood had dug tunnels under the temple of God, by the way, the place where God said he would dwell to meet with the people. They dug a tunnel underneath the temple. And there are 70 elders of Israel that are mentioned. They were down there doing detestable things, which included idol worship. This is right underneath the temple. And it's interesting, as he goes on explaining this in Ezekiel 8, it's interesting that God said the most detestable thing was what was happening above the ground. Because above the ground, and this wasn't in the inner temple, it was in the outer courts, from what I understand with the English words. The entrance in the inner court, there were men in it that were bowing eastward to the sun. There were women at the north gate, which is the fence around the temple. It's the outer court, I guess you would call it. They were mourning the god Tammuz. The god, lowercase g, Tammuz. Now, if you've been here before, what are the gods that he's talking about? When God says, you shall have no other gods before me, is he talking about just a statue?
No.
Just an inanimate object?
No.
Well, he's talking about those fallen angels that wanted to be worshipped by men. One of which we know his name. There it is. God said that's most detestable. So what you have here, the whole country has been corrupted. It's so corrupted that you got idolatry happening right in the temple of the Lord. And it started with what? It started with the conspiracy of the leadership to institute this stuff by secret, by occult. We could find some parallels in our own society, couldn't we? I can. God told Ezekiel, said, I can't dwell in this temple anymore. It's unclean now. It's defiled now. This is disgusting. This stuff is detestable to me. I can't dwell with you anymore here. See what they did by letting these people get in charge? By letting these people take over and subvert what was originally holy? You chased God plumb out of there. Now, in those days, we didn't have the Messiah hadn't come yet. That was the intermediary between man and God. It was the high priest meeting God in the temple. They didn't have that anymore because they chased God out of there with their detestable practices, as God put it. So that's how the whole nation got corrupted, by a conspiracy among the leadership. So I want to use this to point out to you a few things. And the first thing I want to point out, that conspiracies are in the Bible. If you didn't know that before, I'm telling you now, conspiracies are in the Bible. You can read about that one in Ezekiel 8. What about what happened to Jesus? What about the plot against Jesus? Did the Pharisees and Sadducees and teachers of the law get together out in public and have a big meeting and say, this man here is innocent, and actually he's shown every indication that he actually is the Messiah, the Son of God, but we're going to falsely accuse him and frame him for blasphemy and put this innocent man to death? Is that what they did? No, what did they do? They met in secret, and they determined how they were going to try to trap him, get him arrested, and get him executed, right? Now, that's the definition of a conspiracy. It's two or more people getting together in secret to decide the fate of someone else or others. That's what a conspiracy is. That's all it is. It's happened throughout history, over and over again. On a small scale, you probably witnessed one or two in your life. I witnessed plenty. I saw it in college. I saw it in the military. I saw it in high school. I saw it sometimes in my own family. That's what it means to conspire. You meet secretly with someone else and decide the fate. Two or more people meet secretly and decide the fate of someone else. So, I have a question for you. Does the devil do everything personally? Does he come down here physically, roll up his sleeves, and actually do all the work himself? No, we see that. We see that from experience, and we see that in the Bible, right? He has people who do his bidding. People who are in his kingdom. In other words, people who don't love the truth. People who have not on purpose aligned themselves with the kingdom of God, right? He uses other people to carry out his agenda. So, knowing that, I want to talk a little bit about this subject. And it takes no small amount of courage to talk about it, because when you talk about these things, you get accused of all kinds of stuff. You get accused of being a kook. The popular phrase right now is tinfoil hat type. Like I'm up here wearing tinfoil hats to protect my brain waves from the man trying to mind control me. You get ridiculed and belittled and basically dismissed as a lunatic when you talk about these things. And here I am talking about them to you. But at least I made the case first that you can see this kind of thing right in the Bible. Now see, a lot of Christians will poo-poo the idea of conspiracy. Most of them, I would say, most of them do. And yet, most of them believe literally that Satan exists. The devil exists. If you can believe in a literal, devil, why is it so hard for you to believe in a literal, that he uses people to accomplish his will? He is, yeah. And we're talking about deception. And he is the master of it. So that's a rhetorical question. Something I don't understand. You can believe in a literal devil, but you can't believe that he uses his people to accomplish his will down here, to carry out his agenda. And obviously they got to do it in secret. They don't want to come right out front and tell you what they're doing, or not enough people will go along with it. Believers wouldn't go along with it. You got believers going along with it now because they're ignorant. Something I'm trying to help with. Most believers poo-poo end-time prophecy. I'm taking a risk just talking about that. And there's a rhetorical question for that. I mean, all of the prophecy about the Messiah's first coming were fulfilled. Literally, to the letter. All of them were fulfilled. But we're supposed to believe that the prophecies about his next coming are just purely symbolic and God didn't really mean it. It's not really going to happen. How can you justify that? If he was 100% accurate the first time, he's going to be 100% accurate the next time. He's never failed ever. All his prophecies have been, they're 100% accurate. You know, people talk about Nostradamus like he's something special. What is 20% or less of his prophecies came true? And the same with all these psychics. God's standard is 100%. He was 100% right about the first time. He's 100% right about the second time. Why do we assume that it's all just symbolic or we can dismiss it when he's talking about the next thing that happens? I mentioned here before that he held people accountable for knowing when he was coming back because it was predicted to the very day, it was prophesied to the very day, the day he was going to present himself as king in Jerusalem. But there's other believers. Thank God there's some believers who do believe that the Bible's serious about end-time prophecy. But when you start telling them about the things that are going on and how this is all being put into place, they don't want to believe it. It's like they believe that all these things are just going to accidentally fall into place overnight or something. You point out the things that are happening right before their eyes. And that's conspiracy theory. What? You think that just the rapture is going to happen and the next day everything's just going to magically fall into place by accident?
Yeah, right.
No, these things, the groundwork has to be laid in advance, right?
Right.
We know from the Bible. We know if we've read enough of it, if we've done our homework, we know that there's a worldwide global governmental system going to be implemented, a dictatorial, totalitarian system. I'm way off my notes. Let me catch up. The Bible tells us that the entire world is going to be under a central government. Okay, we know that from reading the prophecy. With a central economy and a unified religion. A single central government for the entire world with a central economy and a unified religion. We know that from reading the Word. We know God said it, so it's true. It's going to happen. And we can see, if we open our eyes, we can see the groundwork being laid for that right now. And frankly, we can see it. It's real easy to see for the last 100 years. Last 101 years, actually. These things don't happen by accident. They don't fall into place. The devil can't wave a magic wand and make it happen. Don't get me wrong, he is powerful. But he uses people to accomplish his ends on this earth. He didn't snap his fingers and magically make the fruit go into Eve's mouth, did he? He did what? He deceived her. The system has to be in place by the time the lawless one is revealed, doesn't it?
Yes.
Which means the groundwork for that system has to be laid beforehand. The instruments of control have to be built or arranged beforehand. And the devil uses his followers, his knowing and unknowing followers, because like I said, not all of them are overt devil worshippers. A lot of them identify themselves as good witches, or not even witches. A lot of them identify themselves as atheists, or frankly, some of them identify themselves as Christians. So I'm not leaving anybody out. I wish I could say that evil hadn't infiltrated the church, but it has. It definitely has.
Oh, yeah.
So he uses his followers, knowing and unknowing, to lay the groundwork for the system that the Bible tells us is going to be in effect when the man of lawlessness is revealed. And they have to work in secrecy and practice deception to make it all come together. When you see that and you understand it and you pay attention to what's going on, things make a lot more sense why things are happening the way they are in the world. You need me to wrap it up, babe? We get ready to eat? Okay. All right, I'm going to cut her off there for now. And I'll continue this next time and probably add on a little more.
Good. Good. That's
I hope I didn't confuse anybody.
No, you were very
It's probably not the ideal place to
you were
stop,
very,
but
you were very clear.
thank you, Doug. Thank you.
Very interesting.
Okay. All right. I'll go on a little bit further. Now, see, here's the problem, and this happens when you talk about these things with believers and non-believers. I'm almost done, but not quite. As soon as they're ready to dish out the food, I'll stop, guys. When you talk about conspiracy, that whole word has a built-in reaction. It seems like when you talk about it with most people, they automatically dismiss it out of hand. I know this from experience, by the way. First of all, they automatically dismiss it out of hand. That's ridiculous. If you show them some facts, they automatically try to explain those facts away. You show them more facts, they dismiss them all as coincidence. I call these people coincidence theorists, by the way. They call me a conspiracy theorist, I call them coincidence theorists. If they stick around long enough for you to build a strong case of overwhelming evidence, because frankly, you don't have to have a top secret clearance in the CIA to find this stuff out. A lot of it's because the society has been free for long enough, a lot of this information is available. Now, like I said, the devil's got some crafty, complex schemes, and he confuses people by mixing in a lot of fabricated hokum to discredit the truth. Anytime you talk about this stuff, you're going to have people come forward and talk about lizard people and aliens and all kinds of off-the-wall stuff to discredit. Thank you, babe. I really need that. That's radar love right there. I didn't even have to say anything. I don't even know if she saw me look down the bottle, wishing I had a drink. She had me covered. You show them more facts. You show them some facts, they automatically try to explain it away. Show them more, they dismiss it all as coincidence. If they stick around long enough and you build a strong case of overwhelming evidence, their reaction is almost always irrational anger. They get mad at you. I don't want to listen anymore. I don't want to hear it anymore. They have no logical explanation for the evidence you give them. They can't continue to argue that it's coincidence because that's just ridiculous. But now I'm angry, therefore you're wrong. You made me mad, therefore your argument has no validity. Again, I said I'm speaking from experience here. Frankly, why I stopped talking to people. Why for a long time I stopped trying to share the truth. Because this is the kind of stuff I run into. People aren't ready for the truth. They don't love the truth. They reject it, in fact. They'd rather be deceived. What did Mark Twain say? At least I think the quote was from him. It says, easier to deceive someone than to convince them they have been deceived. Well, folks, if you haven't tried that, that's more true than you can imagine.
So true.
That anger, that irrational anger, when you get to the point where they can't refute your argument anymore, that's what Pavlov referred to as a conditioned response.
Oh, yeah, Pavlov's experiment, yes.
For those who don't know who Pavlov was, he did an experiment with dogs. Forgive me if I get the details wrong, but I'm going to give you the gist of what it was. He had some dogs and he fed them. Before he fed them, he either sounded off a bell or he did it at a certain time. Or I think he sounded a bell or a buzzer or something. And then he would feed them. And after he'd done that for a while, he had them conditioned so that all they had to do is hear the buzzer and they start salivating.
That's right.
They start slobbering. They hadn't seen the food yet, but they made that connection with the buzzer and food. So they just had to hear the buzzer and they started salivating. a conditioned response.
There you go, condition.
And frankly, a whole lot of humans have been conditioned. They've been conditioned to reject the truth out of hand. Say it's ridiculous to ridicule the people that bring them the truth. There's other assumptions, and I want to touch on one. I think I might have time for one more one. Is that there's an assumption that conspiracies are only possible short term. So in other words, the JFK conspiracy, that was true, but everything else is false. Everything else is concocted by what Hillary Clinton calls the vast right-wing conspiracy. Think about that circular logic or contradictory logic. It's just impossible to keep them long term. Well, let me think of a really ridiculous deception. What if I told you that generations of adults, some of them without even knowing each other, some of them being 1,000 miles away, never in communication with each other, they conspired to deceive a certain demographic, and they zealously kept to this deception over generations and centuries. And the deception is pretty ridiculous. You want to hear what it is? It's that a magical fat man with flying reindeer at the North Pole delivers presents once a year at midnight to all the children in the world, enclosed in a bag that he can hang over his shoulder. Isn't that what it is? Is that not the definition of a conspiracy? All these adults are conspiring to deceive children, to make them believe in something that doesn't exist. And now your next argument is, well, yeah, okay, but that's harmless. I'm not going to go into whether it's truly harmless right now. But, so if you accept the fact that conspiracies can't exist long term, you're saying that people will not intentionally work toward the harm of others. Is that what you're saying? Human beings are incapable of doing something that harms? They can only conspire if it's harmless? Does that fit your experience with other human beings? About ready? All right. Okay. I hope I've whetted your appetite, because there's more I'm going to go into on this. And just before I close, I want to reemphasize what I said at the beginning. I'm talking about some evil stuff and some scary stuff. And it probably strikes a lot of you as crazy, loony stuff. But I want to emphasize that Jesus is superior to all of that.
Yes.
If you have him, then you have something that's greater
Yes.
than all the machinations of the enemy. And trust in him, and you'll end up on the winning side.